Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode, number 125, is putting blocks together the easy way. But before we get to that, let's get to my opinion. This past week, the Surgeon General of the United States came out and said that being parents created anxiety and stress. And all I could think about was how my quilting and sewing has relieved my stress over the years. I'm not a doctor. I have no medical training. All I know is in the last 30 years, I had two parents and a sister get sick with cancer and die. And I also had a difficult divorce. And I know for sure that if I didn't have that getaway of my sewing, I'd be in the loony bin. So with that, I'd like to say, could we help our fellow people who are struggling with anxiety? The parents, yes, they have anxiety. But those kids are going to grow up at some point and be parents too. So it doesn't have to be quilting. It doesn't have to be sewing. I think that in my opinion, having a passion to get you away from your stress is so important. So whether it's any of the needle arts, the quilting, knitting, did I already say needlepoint? Any of the needle arts. But there's also everything else out there. It could be woodworking. It could be painting or drawing, beading, anything that gives you a passion, music, anything that you would want to do. One of my staff says she's always tried to expose her children to several different things to see what they like. And I think that's a really good way to go. If we can help our grandchildren or our neighbor say, would you like to make a quilt with me? But just encourage people to find a passion. And maybe we could bring that stress level down for both the parents and also for the children who are at one time going to be parents. So that's my opinion today, a little off the beaten path. At any rate, I have two quilts behind me here. This one you've seen before. This is the one that the customer dropped off scraps for the dog bed stuffing bag, and I thought they were too good to throw in the dog bed stuffing, so I made this quilt out of it. Recently, we had a customer who she doesn't take any of her scraps home. When we quilt a quilt for her, no matter how big the hunk of the back is that wasn't used, she takes nothing home. Once she finishes a quilt, she wants nothing to do with the rest of the pieces. So she brings them into us. Now, if it is fabric that we can use for Project Linus quilts, we do. But this was a whole lot of black, gray, and black and white fabrics. And we had so much that I know Project Linus didn't want. And so I had each member of our staff, I said, take whatever you want from this box. Just take whatever you want. And this is what was left. I got the dregs, the last of the box. When I say dregs, it's all high quality fabric. She doesn't buy junk. She only buys first quality quilt shop type fabric. And when I had all the scraps together, it just looked blah. So I said, what do I want to add to it? Now, I know I always bill this as you don't have to add anything to it. But in this case, the quilt was just going to do nothing for me if I didn't add something. And I would say normally with black and white, I pick a red, maybe a yellow, orange, teal. I would never pick this brownie color. But I saw a quilt that Linda, she's the gal who did the episode with me that we chose fabrics for a quilt. She added this to one of her quilts from that stash of fabric. And I said, you know what? I'm going to try something that I wouldn't normally try. And so I added this, and I only used less than a 1/4 yard of fabric. So to get this whole big quilt top with only a 1/4 yard of fabric from my stash and the rest all donated, I think I did pretty good. And this, of course, is my world's greatest scrap quilt pattern, and we will have the link in the description below. Now, let's get to today's episode. Today, we are talking about putting blocks together the easy way. I have 4 tips here, and we're going to go over each one individually. But the bottom line is, you finished your quilt blocks. Some have many, many seams, and when you put them together, you would just make it much more difficult to get all the seams to meet perfectly. So how do we avoid that? If we can, sometimes you can't. If we can, you want to avoid the seams meeting, and you can do that by adding an alternate block. You can frame your block. You can add sashing, or you can orientate your blocks alternating seams. We're going to show you examples of all 4 of these. This is an example of adding an alternate block. This book I've shown you several times before, Making Quilts for Baby by Ursula Reichs, not in print. You can get it from Amazon. This is actually the pattern that I used for my beginning series, and it's a 4-patch alternated with a solid block. And you can see if you didn't have this solid block in here, you'd have to meet this seam to this seam, and that just makes it more difficult. So in addition to being able to use another fabric in your quilt, it just makes putting the blocks together easier. So that's always an option, to take a pieced block and put a solid block in between. Next, I've got frame the block, and you just saw this last week or the week before. This is the Boxed In from Julie Herman, and she has these blocks framed. And think, if these weren't here, this seam would meet this seam. You'd have all these seams meeting, and it would just make for more pinning, slower sewing, just more difficult. The frame just makes putting the blocks together so much easier. The next on our list is add sashing, and that I also have in the same book. And this is a shoe fly block here. Yeah, that looks good. Shoe fly block, and put sashing in between, because if you didn't, this block would meet this block. These would all meet, and then in addition, they'd meet up here as well. So that's a lot of meeting seams, and using the sashing prevents you from having to meet those seams together. So another way to avoid seams meeting. The last thing I want to show you, and this you kind of have to pay more attention to, especially if your block has direction in it. But this is a block that I've done many times in many different sizes, and if you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see because the black and the blue are so dark, but this is a solid piece, solid piece. This is a solid piece, solid piece. If this block were turned 90 degrees so that this side met this side, this seam would meet this seam. Actually, it'd be this seam would meet this seam. And to avoid that, this is where you alternate the direction of your blocks. In This one we have the longer pieces on the top, and this one we have the longer pieces on the side. And that's how you do top, side, alternating. And then again, the above where they come together, here's the seam, meets the one with no seam. Here's the seam, meets the one with no seam. Now this is why you have to know your directions from the start, because if you say you want the top of this block to be here, it's not going to work. The top has to be here. So as you plan your quilt, you want to, and when there's no direction, you don't have to worry about it. But if there is a direction, you need to stay consistent and piece your blocks the same with the tops, I should say where they belong, whether it's here or here, which these two are opposite. So it takes a little bit of thinking when there's direction, but if there's no direction, all you do is alternate by 90 degrees the tops and sides of the quilt. I hope that makes sense. That was a little kind of garbled, but I hope that that made sense to you. So there are ways to make the piecing of your, or I should say putting together your blocks, your pieced blocks together easier and avoid having to match additional seams. Let's get to the winner of the giveaway. The winner of the Sidelights quilt top is Victoria Stewart, 2152. Please email me your address to quiltersheaveninc@gmail.com so I can get it out to you. This week's giveaway is a carpenter star. It's small. It's a kind of a little wall hanging. It's 36 by 36, and it is made up of half square triangles, and I actually even mitered the borders, which I rarely do. But if you'd like to have this quilt top to finish, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, and in the comment section put Carpenter's Star, and you will be entered to win. So thank you so much for watching. That's this week's episode. Until next time, happy sewing.